As Marcus said, I'm in the University of Edinburgh and I am lucky enough at the moment to be in my office. This is our central area campus and I'm in this building just here, and this is the old medical school where we do most of our undergraduate teaching. Okay. I'm hoping that the slides will change in just a moment. There we go. So our context, we are very much using LT in our undergraduate biomedical programs and our medical sciences program. And these two kind of groups of programs kind of run very much in parallel. And what we have is a very broad base in years 1 and 2. And then as students go through into years 3 and 4, they specialise into discipline-related courses. I should point out we're in Scotland, so we have a 4-year degree programme for our science undergraduates, but we do have a number of students who skip year 1 and take direct entry into year 2 based on their prior learning. And this is the view through the archway into our old medical school quad. And this here is the staircase up into one of our labs, and this becomes relevant very shortly in the talk, our beautiful architecture. So we've used LT so far in our year 2 core courses, and these are courses that have 200 to 250 students, so fairly big courses. And we've also used them in a good number of our year 3 specialist courses. So around about 70 to 80% of our year 3 courses, we've used the LT platform. These are slightly smaller courses with about 50 to 100 students. And we span disciplines from clinical biochemistry and haematology through pharmacology, physiology, reproductive biology. So we're really using LT in a really broad range of topics and disciplines. So I was asked to talk about why we chose LT, and it was actually a little bit of a no-brainer for us, but at this point I must give all due credit to Dr. Celine Kakanu and Professor Richard Ribchester. And LT was really their vision from a couple of years ago for extending physiology teaching in a lot of the ways that Dawn has just described to you, utilising existing hardware, but also using LT to expand what we're able to do with our students and do these self-experimentation practicals that students absolutely love. And I remember doing them as an undergraduate, and their vision for what we could use LT for is really ambitious, and how we can integrate the personal physiology of our students as they go through their years at university. I will admit I came to this from a very different perspective actually. So a lot of my undergraduate teaching is pharmacology related. I also do endocrinology teaching, but what I was struggling with in pharmacology teaching were challenges related to ethics of using animal tissues and using animal models. Lab capacity, as we've already heard, that's always a huge issue, you know, being able to get enough students through the lab, get enough time in the lab to do meaningful experiments. The logistics of having the right students in the right place at the right time, the time that it takes to do the experiments. So to do meaningful pharmacological experiments means students being in the lab for a good number of hours, and that has its challenges. And one of the main challenges was the capacity for academic inquiry. So the technical gubbins of getting the experiments can often take so long to get to grips with that actually what we're able to do with these experiments in terms of questioning pharmacology can be a little bit limited by what it's possible for students to accomplish. So my interest was very much in using LT in a virtual mode to extend what we did in our practical classes. So using LT as very much a digital platform. It turns out that that was actually going to work out quite well for us. As Dawn's already talked about, the situation over the last year has meant that most of our teaching has actually been in this digital format. So I promise I wasn't foreseeing the future. It was this was genuinely my interest in it. So how have we used LT? And at this point, I should point out that our purchase of LT was agreed around about September 2020. My remembrance of the date is a little bit hazy, but it was scarily close to the start of semester up here. So we really have no experience of using LT in normal times. We've only used LT in our current COVID-related times. We also have the added complications of dealing with government restrictions. So we're not medical teaching, so we don't have the dispensations that are in place for supporting in-person medical teaching. And we have to work with the government restrictions on social distancing, etc., in our very beautiful but very impractical real estate. So this beautiful photograph here actually shows you the entranceway into our several of our teaching laboratories. And I love giving students directions to this because it's the only time I think I've ever given directions based on turn left at the elephant statues. And it's a great direction to be able to give. But it does mean that being able to host in-person practicals has just been pretty much impossible for this last year. So it means we've got very limited experience of using the hardware, but we have been able to get, so this was actually a trace generated by me in the lab. So we've been able to get small numbers of staff and demonstrators into the labs to be able to record real life data for the students to work with. So they're not able to collect their own data, but they're still using real data, which I think is really important to their experience of working with the practical platform. So this was my data. These are the hands of a demonstrator pipetting into a guinea pig ileum organ bath. This is one of our teaching technicians kindly wired up to the EMG setup that Dawn was talking about earlier. But what we have got is lots and lots of software experience, because as we've been talking about, essentially all of our practical experience moved from this kind of setup to this, where we've got people working either alone behind a screen, or for some lucky students who happen to be in flat shares with other students on the same course, they've been able to get together in person behind a screen, or we've had an awful lot of people working collaboratively online as well. So all of our experience in developing has really been from the software side of LT. And LT has been really powerful for us for digital learning. And we have used LT in several different ways. I've tried to represent this here. So we've got flexibility with how we input our data into LT, or how we ask our students to extract data from LT. So we've been able to use the interactive analysis. So where we have, as I've said, real life data. So again, this is data that I generated here, looking at a concentration response curve to acetylcholine in the guinea pig ileum. We've also got real life data from the EMG practical, the nerve stimulation practical, and we've been able to put that into LT and get students to set regions of interest, measure data. This is showing you a measurement taken from this trace here. But we've also been able to provide students with data. So in some instances where the experiments were quite repetitive, rather than have students kind of slogging away over trace after trace after trace, we did a combination of things where we were able to give them the responses that we'd already calculated from the live traces. We also were able to use LT for practicals where there was no capacity to generate real data. So we've used that mixture. We've also used a mixture of the kind of the off-the-rack lessons. So as Dawn's been talking about, there's a huge amount available within LT of lessons that have already been put together that have got huge amounts of fantastic information in them. Some of our practicals have been pretty much off the rack, but with our own personalised photographs and videos embedded, and our own data embedded in there. But we've also developed bespoke practicals, so things that LT was never designed for, like enzyme-linked immunosorbent assays, spectrophotometric assays. We've used it for looking at gross histology and reproductive biology. We've used it for microbiology practicals, all sorts of things that that we haven't been using off-the-shelf packages for, that we've really just set up from scratch, and integrating these videos and quizzes that Dawn has showed you so beautifully in her presentation. So I'm not going to go through any of the practicals that we built, because I think Dawn has done that really elegantly and eloquently. So rather than repeat that, I'm talking a little bit about how we kind of deconstructed what we wanted to put in our practical. I really like this image. It's been put together by a project called the Wicked Problems Project at the University of Edinburgh. And this was a project looking at deepening student learning and deepening student experience by setting wicked problems or challenging problems. And actually the problem that was put onto us to deliver our teaching in this digital way, particularly practical teaching, is one of these wicked problems. So this really resonates. How do we tie together the knowing, the understanding, the being and becoming a scientist or a clinician, creating information and communicating that with the actual doing of the practical work? And this is one of the real strengths of LT, is this capacity for the active learning, the capacity to have students generating their own data within this virtual digital platform. So we use this kind of framework to really deconstruct what was a practical experience, what were we expecting students to learn. And we came up with a series of activities, which was the kind of the doing, so the performing the experiments, making observations, collecting data, thinking about the data, and also a set of skills. So what students were able to take away from the doing that they were doing as part of their practical. So being able to collect the data, being able to analyse the data, being able to write and communicate their findings. And we unpacked this into the learning objectives of the practicals. And this was where it really was a truly collaborative effort. So this was course organisers across year 2 and year 3 of our programmes, and dozens of course contributors all feeding into this process of how we could, within a matter of weeks, turn all of our practical teaching around from in-person experience into digital delivery. What we've learned is actually that far from being a wicked problem, that we are able to deliver our digital practical experiences. So there's lots of benefits for the students. They can choose where to do their lab, they can do it in their own time, they can revisit materials if they want to. And actually what we found, both in the experience and also in the feedback, was that it really promoted reflective learning in the students. So they were thinking much more about what they were doing, rather than just following a recipe sheet to get out of the lab before the lab closed at 5 o'clock. We also find lots of benefits for us as educators as well. In terms of capacity, we could have huge numbers of students in the practical at the same time. We weren't constrained by lab space, we weren't constrained by lab timetabling, and we had much more flexibility in how we could design and deliver these learning materials. We didn't assess within LT, but we were able to get a lot of information about student performance and feedback within the LT platform as well. And benefits for everybody. So we found a real value in the virtual lab. So myself, I spend almost all of my time behind this desk. This is my desk at home. So this is the other side of what you would normally be seeing, with 2 computers, an extra screen, lots of bits of paper, the inevitable cup of coffee to keep me going. And our students are spending most of their time like this on various platforms like Zoom and Collaborate and Microsoft Teams. And one of the values of LT was that we had this virtual platform that we could signify to the students that they were entering a lab space. And we've done a lot of that with the messaging in our practicals as well. So, at the end of the practical is usually a photograph of somebody, from the back finishing off the practical. So we have the kind of synonymous donning of the virtual lab coat as they come into the practical, and then they take it off again at the end, and we have the messaging about what they're going to do now that they've finished the practical. Our user experience, so the feedback on LT from staff was largely very positive. So lots of positive quotes about how easy and intuitive it was. This was actually one of mine that was collected by Celine, that what I felt I was doing was put together an experience rather than just putting together lots of information. And that came back in the student feedback as well, that was how they felt. They felt they were having an experience rather than just working through a series of instructions. Most people are really very keen to keep LT, to be creative in what they do with it next, and most people have had a very positive experience, with a few minor niggles and caveats that I'll come back to. The student satisfaction scores on our end of course questionnaires were overwhelmingly positive. Everything was over 80%, and some of our courses had 100% satisfaction with the LT platform. And this is a cohort of students who were not able to get into the lab at all this year. So I think those satisfaction scores are fantastic. They really enjoyed it. They recognised some of the elements that were missing, but thought it was hugely valuable. It felt like a different activity. So that was what I was talking about. They felt like they were going into a virtual lab rather than just another lecture. And they really liked the mixture of activities that we were able to coordinate. So overall, a massive success, I think, particularly considering we started using this days before the start of semester in September. So what we've learned, we can put together this practical experience. We can get almost all of our learning outcomes in this digital format, and that students came with us on this shift from very much being told what to do to working through with guidance, of course, but working through at their own pace. They really appreciated the reassurance and the guidance of having the videos and live sessions to support what they were doing in LT. It was an unfamiliar platform. It was the first time they were using it. So it was a little bit like the first time they went into a lab and they didn't know where to go, what to touch, how to put the lab coat on. What we did miss to an extent was the social component of the practical. So seeing what everybody else does. We were able to compensate for some of that by having live online sessions where we had students working together in groups, but I think that's only a partial compensation. One big thing for the future is that we're looking at how to build in an opportunity to make mistakes. And that's something that as a collaborative group of course organisers and course contributors, we think is really valuable in a practical setting. To get an authentic practical experience, you want them to be able to make a mistake. So we're looking at ways of introducing that for next year to really deepen their experience and their learning, and also their understanding and appreciation for what goes on in a lab. Suggestions for LT, this is going to be very brief. We're really just at the beginning of our journey, so we're kind of in the world as our oyster phase, and we're hoping to be able to integrate this into wet labs. Hopefully after the summer. We're still waiting for confirmation of being able to do that. Our main niggles so far have actually been technical, to be perfectly honest. It's things like formatting images, getting true colour on histology slides, being able to zoom in, things like that. Our biggest issue and our biggest gripe, and it's entirely our own fault, and a lot of it comes from the pace at which we're putting together materials, is that once the lessons go live and the students start working through them, any little bugs or mistakes that we've made, we're not able to fix that without resetting the student progress. And that's something that kind of came through from everybody I spoke to who'd worked with LT. We've all had that kind of head slap moment of I should have done that, or I've made a mistake, or I've copied and pasted the wrong table. So I'll just round up, very conscious of time, by saying thank you so much to Celine and Richard for having the foresight to get us so far down the road of getting LT in place, so that we were able to use this platform and rolling out our practical teaching this semester. I think without LT we would have had a very, very different and much less positive experience, both for staff and for students. Thank you to all of the course organisers and the course contributors who've put so much work into getting LT up and running, and a true collaborative community that we have of shared experience of getting things to work. There have been lots of late night and early morning emails flying around in the minutes and hours before sessions are due to go live. I have to thank our professional services staff and the teaching organisation who have been fantastic, our teaching technicians and our administrators for helping us to put all of this together, our students for having the patience to come with us on this learning journey as we've had to correct our own mistakes. I actually think they've enjoyed seeing that side of us. You know, they realise we're not infallible, we do make mistakes, and they have to forgive us for that. I also need to thank Marcus and Tom from ED Instruments, particularly Tom, who ended up, back to the subject of the strangest things you've done in a Zoom meeting. I've actually done live live teaching while being in a training session for LT. So I was teaching LT at the same time as learning about it, and was lucky enough to be in a session with Tom, who was able to fix the technical glitches in my course while I was in a training session. So I think that's probably one of the strangest things I've done while in a Zoom meeting. So thank you very much, everybody. Apologies for the time, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you. I'll just stop sharing.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Dawn. Quick question from Amy around any initial thoughts on how you're going to build in the opportunity for the students to make mistakes in the learning.
So this is one of the things that we're really looking at, how to be able to get students to add the wrong thing to the, so ideally what I'd like to do is to be able to get them to add the wrong drug to the guinea pig alien water bath and see what happens. And it's looking at ways of being able to get a flow chart, of being able to get that to work. So I'm still very much in the ideas. I'm not in the putting it into practice stage yet, but that's one of my ideas, is adding the wrong drug or adding the wrong concentration. Or another thing we have is when we add antagonists to the water bath, often the students don't let them come into equilibrium. They're kind of in a rush to get going. So showing them what happens when they don't do that. So some of them we can predict the kind of the commonly made mistakes, and they're fairly straightforward because you can show those as examples, but it's being able to get that that dynamic, letting a student choose and input a value and showing them what happens and then having to work out what's going wrong. I think that's going to be slightly more challenging. I'm hoping that that Tom's got some ideas for how to make that work.